for the longest time, I thought promises were basically the same as if statements. I genuinely thought some genius at JavaScript decided to replace if and else with resolve and reject and call it a day. Obviously, that isn't what promises are, although they're not nearly as complicated as you might think.
Will you, Severus name yourself, carry out the deed the Dark Lord has ordered Draco to perform?
I will.
The first thing you should know is that promises have two parts. The first part is where the promise is made. So this is where you decide the terms of your promise. So which checkboxes need to be ticked for the promise to be fulfilled and resolved, and what would need to happen for it to be considered failed and rejected. Going on with the unbreakable vow example, let's look at what that might look like. First, we're going to create a promise using the keyword, and it takes a callback function using two parameters, resolve and reject. We're going to use an arrow function to make our lives easier. Now inside this bit you have your if statement. For the sake of our example, I've created a boolean variable called Snape kills Dumbledore, which is either true or false, and based on that the if statement says if this boolean variable is true, then that means the promise is resolved. So you can use the resolve keyword to send back a message saying it has been resolved. And if it isn't true, we're saying the promise was rejected. Now the second part of the promise is where it is called. This is where you call the promise and you decide what you're going to do if the promise is resolved and what you're going to do if it's rejected. So in our example, we're using our promise name, vow, and then we're using the .then keyword. Inside this, we need yet another callback function, this time with one parameter. We're going to call this message because it's going to contain the message that we returned. Now, inside these curly brackets is the code that will run if your promise is resolved. That means if it is successful. We're going to be super boring and just log out our message, but you can do anything here. Now after this, we have a catch statement. Rejected promises are treated like errors. So just like you would catch an error in a catch statement, we're going to catch our rejected message. And this is where you add the code for what should happen if your promise is rejected. In our case, once again, we're logging the message, and because it's an unbreakable vow, we're calling a function that kills the oath breaker. Now in real life, promises are often created and called in separate files, and promises are usually the return value of functions. So let's look at a real life use case. Now let's pretend you had a website, and in this website there is an image that you need to load while the rest of your UI loads. Now you want to be alerted if the image fails to load for some reason. Let's see how we can do that with a promise. First, you have your function. We're going to call it return promise function. Inside this function, we're going straight into our return value. We're returning a promise with a callback function containing two parameters, resolve and reject. And then we have our if statement. So if our image failed to load boolean created somewhere else in the code is true, then we send a reject statement with a message that your image failed to load. And otherwise the image loaded successfully, so we can send a resolve. And that's it for the first part. And the second part of your promise might happen somewhere far away in the code base. In the next part, we call our function that returns a promise, and we add our .then statement. The then part just covers the resolve part of our promise, so we're just going to log out the message because we don't need to do anything. But in the .catch part of our statement, if the image fails to load, we might need to take some actions. You might have a function to try reloading the image or to replace it with an alternative image. So there's lots of actions you might need to take in case of an error. Now this is just one real life use case. There are many use cases for promises, and I hope this makes what's going on just that little bit clearer.